Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Alison Levine, and today I have the pleasure to sit with Vincent Avenel of Domaine Chanson of Beaune, France. That's in the beautiful Burgundy region, a home of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And Vincent, welcome and tell us about Domaine Chanson.
First of all, I would like to say excellent pronunciation.
Oh, thank you.
Domaine Chanson, indeed. Alors, what can I tell you about Chanson? We are one of the institutions in Burgundy. We were founded in 1750, so we are one of the few producers that were founded in the 18th century that are still existing today. And we are based in Beaune, which is not the capital of Burgundy, generally speaking, but when it comes to wine, definitely it's the place to be. And that's where we have been producing wines, as I said, since 1750. And we are in the heart of the historical part of Beaune. For those who will have the opportunity to visit Beaune, they cannot miss our location, because part of our building is actually a very old tower, which was built in the 15th century and which was part of the defense system of the city of Beaune. And that's why actually now we vinify and age our wines. So we have a huge bastion, as it is called, with walls that are 7 to 8 meters thick, and which reproduce or where you find fantastic conditions to vinify and age the wines.
So how much wine do you produce, and where can we find your wine?
That's a very good question. We produce many different wines. You know, it's the concept of Burgundy. We just have 2 grape varieties, as you mentioned before. We have Chardonnay for the whites and Pinot Noir for the reds. But that's just the easy part. And then it becomes a bit more complicated with the concept of terroir, which means that depending on where you grow the vines, you are going to have different types of wines. And at Chanson, for example, we produce more than 80 different wines just with 2 grape varieties. And part of those wines come from our fruits coming from our own estate. We own 43 hectares, which makes Chanson not the largest owner of land in Burgundy, but one of the serious players. And beside this estate, we also have contracts with vine growers, and we pick the fruits, or we buy the must once the fruits are pressed, and we vinify and age those wines in the same facilities and in the same cellars, with the same attention, obviously.
And your total case production?
In France, we don't count in cases.
In your total bottle production?
It's 900 bottles a year, approximately, on average. 900 bottles.
900 bottles.
Yeah. 900,000 bottles. Sorry.
I was going to say 900,000 bottles. So if you're listening, 900,000 divided by 12, you'll figure out how many cases that is.
But I have the jet lag now, and I'm not as good at doing that. And it's not big and it's not small. In Burgundy, you have different, let's say, categories of producers. You have the big négociants, which are far bigger than we are, with sometimes 10, 12 million bottles a year. And you have the small growers with 10 hectares, and they produce 50,000 bottles a year. So I would say that we are sort of in between situation. Not huge, but big.
And what markets are your wines available in?
We sell worldwide. Obviously, the domestic market is from far the largest market for us. It represents 45% of our total business. And then we sell to 70 different countries around the globe. And the United States is market number 1, number 2, depending on the dollar-euro exchange rate, on how French and Americans are in love, and those kind of things.
So are you originally from Beaune?
Not at all, actually. I arrived in Burgundy 20 years ago. I was born in Alsace. And then I moved in different parts of France and Germany, because my father was an officer in the French army. And I studied in Nice, in the southern part of France, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Heilbronn, in Stuttgart. And then I started my career in Bordeaux, actually, in the wine industry. And from Bordeaux, I improved, as you can see, and I arrived in Burgundy. But I love Bordeaux as well. That was just a joke.
And so your family is not from the wine industry in Alsace?
Not at all. I had absolutely no link with wine through my family, but I fell in love with the product, as I said, in Bordeaux, and I dedicated now all my life to wine and worked 3 years in Bordeaux, then 2 years in the Loire Valley, and 20 years ago finally arrived in Burgundy, where I had the opportunity to work for Bouchard-Perret-Fils and William Febvre initially. And then I moved from Bouchard-Perret-Fils, William Febvre to Fèvelet. And finally, I arrived and took the lead of Chanson 2.5 years ago.
Congratulations.
Merci.
So growing up in Alsace, which is, you produce wine there, but your family wasn't in it, what is your first memory relevant to wine?
Actually, I started with wine very late.
Your parents didn't put it in a cup with 3/4 water?
No. That was not, well, I forgot to mention my mother is German. And so wine was not really the priority. My father tried to balance that, but my mother was tough, a tough woman. No, I started with wine and beer and other beverages like that quite late. It was not in my education. And then I realized when I was 18, 19 that it was amazing, food, wine, pairing, and this, and the emotion that you get from it, because it's not just a product. It's pleasure, it's emotion, it's sensation, and for me, what is fantastic with wine is that sometimes it helps you to remember moments of your life. So, as I mentioned to you, I didn't start very early, but I can remember the wine that I opened when my first son was born to celebrate that. And so wine for me has this power of being like a milestone in your history. And in France, as you know, we like to celebrate every day we like to celebrate, actually. So there is always a good opportunity to open a good bottle of wine. But it's true that when we celebrate from something very special, it helps us to remember those good times.
Do you remember, or is there one of the most memorable wines you had? Do you remember an occasion that particularly stands out? And what that wine was? Yeah,
well, actually, it was this bottle of champagne that I opened when my first son was born. Actually, it was a Champagne Henriot, just a non-vintage, nothing really, super expensive, etc. But the wine doesn't have to be super expensive to be great. It's a question of the right moment, the right wine, the right food, the right people, the right occasion, and this emotion, $1,000 cannot buy. So it's a mix of different components.
You've traveled the world abroad. I know that you've been to the U.S., you've lived throughout France, traveled, and Germany, Japan. Who do you think drinks the best in terms of quality?
Not the French. It's true. I say that because usually the French, they drink the wines from the area where they are coming from or where they live, which, taking into account the environment, it's a good thing because they don't need to be transported. So it's because we are very aware about the environment in France, more than in other countries. Yeah, but usually I feel that the highest level of knowledge is probably in the UK. Not everywhere in the UK. I'm talking about London and around London. That's where you see a very high level of education in terms of wine. There are wine merchants like Berry Brothers, for example, who started in the 15th century and who are still there in the center of London. So there is a very long tradition, and British are not always very good at producing things, but very good at selecting things from abroad and bringing it to them. And they have this talent to indeed identify what is exceptional around the world and to import it. And wine is part of those things.
So I'm a little biased because I do know how wonderful Burgundian wine is. But if you took that out of the equation, what is the best foreign wine you've ever drunk?
Vega Sicilia Unico. Yeah, that was for me a revelation. It was the 82 vintage that I tasted. It was probably more than 10 years ago. And at this time, I must say my knowledge about foreign wines was not very high. It's still not very high because there's plenty of things to learn. And I had this typical French attitude, oh, come on, Spanish wine. And wow, my
goosebumps.
Exactly. And again, emotion, pure emotion, probably because also my expectations were low and the wine was indeed fantastic. And for me, that is an experience that I won't forget. So I have now a few bottles of Unico in my own cellar. I have their second wines as well, Vega Sicilia, which are amazing. What
else might we find in your cellar?
Apart from Burgundy, I must say not so many wines. I love Riesling as a grape variety, and so I have some wines from Alsace, from Germany, Vega Sicilia, as I just mentioned, Champagne as well. I love Champagne, but apart from that, I must say it's mainly Burgundy.
It's a cellar I'd like to have. Do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
I don't like to give a clear answer to that, because for me, it could give the idea that there is one thing that is the best and nothing else exists. And when you love wine, I think what you love is diversity. And the most boring thing is to have the same thing all the time. And so for me, I love to switch from one grape variety to the other. But what I found very interesting are wines that are monocépage, one single grape variety, because they are not a wine that has been built by blending different grape varieties. It's one grape variety expressing one specific location. And that is the philosophy that I love. And the grape varieties that are very good to do that are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Riesling.
Almost perfect varieties.
Right, almost.
Almost. What is your opinion of wine critics and scores?
It's a necessary evil.
I've heard that before.
I think when people comment your wines, obviously we put a part of us in our production. So we are obviously very sensitive to comments. And when they are positive, we think the critic is fantastic and understood everything. and sometimes it's not working, and we think, oh my God, he's not getting it. But I think that wine is a very complicated subject, and so it's important that people can find some information. And I would say that it's like in many other subjects. The more critics there are, the best it is, because the idea is not just to have one single meaning, but it's trying to compare and to cross ideas. And most of the time, it works pretty well. I would just like to mention that sometimes the critics are a bit conservative. It's strange, because for me, being a journalist, I'm not a journalist, but when I imagine being a journalist, you need to be a sort of someone who wants to explore, someone who wants to go off the beaten path, someone who doesn't want to follow not the rules, but the pre-established things. And most of the time, I found journalists in wine quite conservative. I mention that because Chanson, with such a long history since 1750, went through many different phases. We had our ups and downs, etc. And in the 90s, no doubt, it was more of a down. And sometimes I meet journalists who have still the image of the 90s and who haven't really seen what has happened in the last 10 or 15 years at Chanson. And they don't even come to visit us to see the investment and to retaste and revisit the wines there. So sometimes I think that they should be more adventurous and try to refresh what they think is an idea, but it's an idea from the past.
Yeah, take out sort of any preconceived ideas or memories and see what's new.
Yeah, exactly. Because very often people think that Burgundy is kind of a very not an old-fashioned area, but it's true. We have a very long history. I mean, we talk about the Cistercian monks and the Benedictine monks more than 1,000 years ago. So sometimes people have the feeling, it's a bit dusty and old school, etc. But it's not true. I mean, I've been working 20 years now in Burgundy, and you see producers who are improving, producers who are declining, producers who you have a generation change, or you have a different owner, and things happen. And so it's important for the journalists to follow up and to make sure they bring the right information to the customers.
So let's talk about you as a consumer, as a wine consumer. Red, white, or rosé?
Alors, definitely not rosé. I drink a lot of rosé, but for me, it's not the price. I mean, I drink rosé as an easy drinking wine, to be honest, and I love it because sometimes you don't want to have something super intellectual. You just want to have a nice, refreshing wine, and it's true in the summertime or in California when the weather is nice, which is not the case today. I'm sure I can enjoy a nice glass of rosé. But for me, really, I tend to focus more on red wines and white wines, and then. It's not. I don't prefer a color. It really depends what I'm going to eat. Actually, for me, the most important thing is to find the right combination. It's like I like delicate red wines. I like strong red wines. I like white wines with minerality, and some others with a bit more buttery flavors. It really depends the mood, the opportunity, the occasion, what you're going to combine with.
Well, speaking of which, how do you approach food and wine pairing? Do you feel there are rules that you have to follow with the light reds, the bigger reds, meats and fishes, or do you feel that there's another way to look at food and wine pairing?
First rule, no rules. And it's all very empirical. Obviously, after a while, you get some experience, so you kind of anticipate what is going to work or not. But sometimes you are very surprised, and what you thought would work actually don't work at all. And sometimes you try something by accident, and it works, and it's fantastic. To give you an example, I was in Japan with my importer a few years ago, and we were talking about those wines, for like Château Chalon from the Jura area, which have very strange flavors that sometimes people think it's corked.
Yeah.
No, it's not corked, but it's the style, and it's strange. You need to be educated to enjoy those wines. And I said to him, yeah, I love those wines. Also with cheese, with Fonte, or with the poultry, with a sauce, with morels. But I told to him, but it's apart from Fonte and poultry, what can you combine with? And he said to me, oysters.
Yes.
And I said, what? You sure? I couldn't imagine the combination of those wines on oysters. And I tried, and indeed, it works very well. So there's always something to discover and to learn.
So you try it, and if it works, great. And if it doesn't, don't do it again.
And try something else.
What do you think that a non-drinker loses out on by not tasting your wines?
What I think of people who have not enjoyed our wines and what they are missing, we have a vinification technique at Chanson which is very specific and which really differentiates us from the crowd, I would say. And this is a vinification technique which is called whole cluster vinification. That's for our Pinot Noir, that's for our red wines. And this technique used to be the traditional vinification technique in Burgundy for Pinot Noir, but was slightly abandoned after the Second World War because it's a complicated technique. But I'm going to give you a few names of producers who continue to do that. La Romanée Conti.
Who?
DRC in American. Leroy, Domaine Leroy. Domaine Dujac. Claude et Lambray. Those producers do 50 to 100% whole cluster vinification. At Chanson, it's exactly the same. We do 70% to 100% whole cluster vinification. I don't need to mention what is the price of the bottles of the producers that I just mentioned. So If you are a wine geek and you dream of tasting wines that are made this way, but you don't have $5,000 to put in a bottle, there is another option.
Your wine.
Exactly. And they are not at $5,000 a bottle. We have expensive wines, but not over the top. Our wines, you can find them between $20 to $500, depending on the appellation, depending on the vintage. But for the guys who are really interested into wine and who love this approach of vinification, we are a great option, definitely.
So if space aliens were landing on your property, you said you make 80 different wines from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. What particular wine would you want to present to them?
Oh, you have tough questions. My God. It's just one?
Oh, if you like them, I guess you could give them a couple.
The thing is, I never have this approach. That's why I'm a bit lost, because for me, it's important when I present Chanson to space invaders or to other people, I like to show them our style, and it's linked to what I said before, this vinification process with whole bunch vinification. I like to show them through different appellations. And then actually, it's not me who has to decide what they like. I show them a range, different prices, different location, different typicity or styles. And then it's up to them actually to make the choice. That's what I love. I mean, I'm not here to say, this is great and this is what you should drink. I'm here to say, this is how we make it. This is why we think it's great to make it this way. And then it's up to you in this range to find le bonheur, your happiness.
So, I live in California where we tend to have more consistent weather, although you happen to be here on one of those rare days where the sun isn't shining perfectly. I'm sorry. It's just one out of 600 days that we get this. But where you're from, you have more rain and more diversity in your temperatures throughout a year. And I'm curious, we know that vintage tells a different story every year, but do you find in the years that you've been working in wine that there are more similarities from year to year or, differences? How do you define vintage?
You're totally right. The weather in Burgundy is totally different compared to California, and it's why Pinot Noir and Chardonnay have performed so well in this area, and why it has become the holy grail. I'm not French arrogant saying that it's the best, but
it's up there.
Some people say it. And one of the reasons is not just that there is limestone in the soil. It's actually also the climate, and the climate is called semi-continental, which means we are far from the sea, so we have less influence from the ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean. It's semi-continental, that means it's drier than, for example, in Bordeaux, because Pinot Noir hates humidity. It's very sensitive to disease, so it likes to have a drier climate. And then we have big contrast of temperature. If you compare the summertime, obviously in the winter, we can go from minus 15, 20 Celsius degrees to 40 Celsius degrees in the summertime. So that's a huge difference. And also a big difference is the temperature during the night and the temperature during in the same day, night and day. And this contrast helps to increase two aspects in the fruit: the maturity, the sugar, but also preserving the acidity at the same time. And that's what makes our wines so fantastic. It's the balance, because it's not just fruit, it's not just acidity, obviously, it's a nice balance of both. And that's what gives to the wine this character, this unique ability to express a location and a vintage. But we have global warming, obviously, as well in France, and we see that we get more and more warmer and warmer temperatures year after year, and that we start the harvest earlier and earlier. But still, I mean, we had recently 2013 vintage, which is not centuries ago, and we started the harvest in October, and so that means that we still have cooler vintages. I think what has really changed in terms of weather and vintage is that now we have more extreme things that happen during the year, either drought or frost or hail. It happened in the past as well, but now it happens in a very short period of time. We have very extreme weather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And each year is throwing you a different sort of curveball.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the fun, because we don't only have 80 different locations. We also have every year a different type of weather. And very often we have the question, does it remind you of another vintage? And sometimes we can make a comparison, but honestly, after 20 years working in Burgundy, I have the feeling each time it's a new challenge and a new experience, which makes it fantastic, because you can never get bored with Burgundy. I think that's one of the reasons why people who are really seriously involved in wine always finish with Burgundy, because with Burgundy there is a diversity that you cannot find anywhere else on the planet, and that's the treasure of Burgundy. It's this diversity, location and vintages that varies a lot.
Do you have any good luck rituals that you perform at the beginning of harvest every year? Any traditions that the winery does?
No, we have a tradition at the end of the harvest when Finally, we made it again. It's a dinner that is called La Polée, where we gather everybody and we have party. But not before. No, before it's tough. Honestly, it's a lot of pressure, and you never know what's going to happen with the weather. And at Chanson, because we do this whole cluster vinification, we need to do the extra mile. We cannot harvest too early because we need the phenolic maturity, which means that it's not only the sugar, it's really the ripeness of the skin, of the stem, of the pips. And that implies that usually we start the harvest something like 1 week later than the others. And when you do that, obviously you take a major risk, because if it rains or if there is a storm or a hailstorm, even worse, then obviously you lose everything. But we are ready to do this extra mile to produce wines that have an extra dimension.
And for these wines with an extra dimension, do you find yourself ever walking through the vineyards and talking to your grapes or speaking to them in the cellar? And if so, what do you say to your wine?
I don't speak to my wines or to the vines, but we walk through our vineyards with my technical director, who is called Jean-Pierre Confuron, who is a very talented winemaker. He comes from a very famous family from Vaune-Romanée. The estate is called Confuron Côte d'Ito. And with him, before the harvest, we visit each plot. And what we do is we look obviously at the fruit. We have the analysis, but it's not just a question of analysis, it's also a question of taste. So we taste the berries the week before we think the harvest is going to start. And depending on how we taste the berries and how the seeds or the pips are looking, we decide if we wait a little bit more or if we start a bit early. For us, what is really important is the taste, first of all. And then also the pips gives you an indication about the ripeness. If they're still a little bit of green, then you should wait. The pips should be brown. And when they are brown and when they are, I don't know if it's crunchy or
crunchy.
Yeah, that means it's ripe and you can pick.
So when you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a pilot. A jet fighter pilot, yeah. Voilà.
You took a very different turn. And when you're not working, how do you spend your free time?
I sleep. No, I say that because I travel a lot, obviously, and a lot of jet lag is involved. So I have a very quiet life when I come back home. I have a very simple taste. I live in the countryside, not far from Beaune. And for me, my pleasure is to spend time with my son, with my wife, to go to the market, to buy food, to drink even more wine during the weekend, and to enjoy life. Yeah.
And if you were planning a romantic evening with your wife on those nights that you're home and not traveling, what wines would you be serving up for that romantic evening?
That's a good question. My wife, anyway, she prefers white wines. Mm-hmm. She loves Burgundy wines. So it will be definitely something like a Meursault or a Puligny-Montrachet. A Meursault Charme, for example. That's by coincidence, but that's the wine that we are enjoying right now. It's a Premier Cru, and it's called Charme. So if I had a romantic dinner with my wife, that would be great.
What was the best piece of advice you ever received?
The best piece of advice I ever received? Be patient. My wife.
And if you could offer some advice to our listeners today, what kind of advice would you like to give them?
Be curious and go off the beaten path. Obviously now I'm talking more about wine, but it's really for me, don't be a follower. Don't be a label drinker. Make your own experience and challenge preconceptions.
What would you say your proudest achievement in your work is to date?
Well, my position right now, to be honest. I mean, it's going to sound very...
Despite the jet lag?
No, but I am the managing director of Chanson. As I said before, when we started the interview, I'm not from a wine family. I was not predestiné. I don't know how you say
predestined.
Yeah, predestined to work in the wine industry. And as you probably know, because you have interviewed many people, most of the time they are family-owned businesses, and it's the father, it's the son. So to be an outsider, you could say, and to have the honor of leading producer from the 18th century with 43 hectares of Premier Cru, Grand Cru in Burgundy it's fantastic. I'm very proud, and it's both proud and honored to be in this position.
Well, congratulations. Yes. So finish this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
It's not worth it.
Okay, another question for you. A VIP person, living or dead, anyone, any walk of life, a very important person of fame of some sort or notoriety is sitting at a restaurant, and the paparazzi take a photo through the window, and in the back is a bottle of your wine, like the one we're drinking right now, Merceau, sitting on the table. Who would you want that person to be?
My president.
Your current president?
Exactly. Oh yeah, definitely.
Of the country or of the winery?
No, of the country.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just checking.
Mr. Macron, yeah.
Hopefully he'll listen and he'll come visit.
Yeah, no, because I think he's a great ambassador for France worldwide. And I think he gives a very good image of our country, of a young president. He has a lot to do, definitely. But I hope he will continue his good job.
And he needs to take a break and come have some beautiful Domaine Chanson.
It can help.
So I know that there's a long history with the winery, and obviously wine has been produced in France for hundreds of years. Do you think that we will be drinking wine in 200 years' time, 1,000 years' time?
Yeah. I hope so. If it's not the case, it would mean that France has become a desert, perhaps because of the global warming, and that would be a pity for sure. But no, normally I'm pretty sure that in 100 or 200 years, we will fix partly the problem of global warming. I hope so. I hope people will understand it. We will adapt. Perhaps we won't grow exactly the same things in the same place, but it's also the history of human beings to adapt and to move depending on what's happening on the planet. But I'm sure people will always drink wine, even if sometimes I'm a bit surprised that there is a sort of people are getting tougher and tougher about wine because of alcohol, etc. And I understand when people don't have consumption that is not normal, but you see reasonable. Mm-hmm. But wine is not a poison. I mean, wine is part of our culture. The first people who planted Pinot Noir, or not Pinot Noir, but grape variety in Burgundy were the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. It's part of, I think, our culture. So I'm sure people will continue, but perhaps not exactly in the same way.
So, if Burgundy became a desert and you were sent off to a deserted island or left on this island, what 3 wines would you want to take with you?
I would like to take a magical bottle that never gets empty.
You can have
Does
that.
It exist?
It does. In this world it does, but what would be in that bottle?
Three bottles.
Or 3 wines?
3 wines. Well, it will be a red Burgundy, a white Burgundy, and a German Riesling.
Okay. With all the travel that you've done, and you have the benefit of being able to travel for your work. And
can I have 4?
You can have 4.
I need bubbles as well, so champagne has to be part of it as well. Okay.
4 bottles. Absolutely.
When do we go?
So, just going back, if you've gotten to travel a lot and explore different places, and you get to travel for work to wine regions as well as non-wine regions. But is there one region that's on the top of your list that you would like to explore?
Spain. Yeah. As I mentioned to you, one of my favorite ones is Vega Sicilia. I've never been there, and I would love to see it.
We know where your next vacation is.
It's true, but it will be Madrid, actually. and on vacation, I mean, funnily enough, it's vacation. And for me, it's the last thing I want to do on vacation. It's to visit wineries. Because to drink wine, I love to discover other things, but to visit wineries is for me like going to another office, if you see what I mean. And I love my job, but from time to time, it's good to switch off a little bit.
Well, before we switch off here, you had mentioned to me that the winery is named after a family, but it also has another meaning. And what is that?
First of all, I would like to mention that our winery is called Chanson, but actually the initial name of the winery was Very. It was the name of the founder of this producer in 1750, Mr. Very. So it was called Domaine Very. And then a Mr. Chanson get married with a Madame Very, and then he took over the company, and then he renamed with his name Chanson, which is a family name, as you understand it, but has also a meaning, which is a song. As you probably know, chanson d'amour, love song. And then it's a new family that bought this producer in 1999, and it's the family Bollinger, which is initially from Champagne. So always a family-owned producer, but 3 different families through history.
Well, I know that you mentioned that this means love song, which brings me to our last point.
I'm going to sing.
No, you don't have to sing, but one of the things we do on Wine Soundtrack is we like to talk about, we know that there's a lovely correlation between wine and music, whether it's people's love of music, they've had other jobs in it, but wine usually makes us think of different songs. So speaking of some of the wines, I want you to tell me, it could be a genre of music or it could be a particular song or a particular artist. But we're sitting here enjoying this beautiful Meursault Charmes 2016. What music should we be listening to right now if you didn't have to listen to me?
Chanson d'amour. That's an old song, I think. Yeah. No, what kind of music? I think it's like Burgundy is like music. You have a huge diversity, and for some people it will be Jean-Sébastien Bach, and for others it will be the Rolling Stones. I mean, it's the spectrum is super wide, like with music, and then it's a very personal thing. And for me, no, I couldn't really relate it to a specific type of music.
Well, considering you sang for me, I'm not going to make you go any further.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to take those notes and I'm going to say thank you. But before we go, if you can just remind our listeners where they can find your wines, and is it possible to visit you?
You can find our wines almost everywhere in the States. Not the 80 different wines, unfortunately, but we are represented in most markets. In the US, we have an importer who is based in Pleasantville, not far from New York, and they organize the distribution statewide. And you can visit us in Beaune when you are on vacation in France. We are just 1.5 hour by train from Paris. You have to go to Dijon, and then you drive further south to Beaune. And Beaune is a lovely little town of 25,000 people with lots of buildings from the Middle Age. And we are in this historical part of Beaune, and we have wonderful cellars from the 15th century that you can visit. You can taste wines and eventually buy a few bottles.
Well, Vincent, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that the next time I see you will be in your 15th century cellars.
Yeah, hopefully. and I hope to come back to Santa Barbara with a better weather.
I hope so too. I hope to bring you sunshine from California, and I look forward to visiting you in the cellars. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.